Okay, I've got a real treat for you today. I'm joined by Matt, the co-founder of the new site, Refold.la, and we'll talk about that. And then also, probably most well known, at least on the YouTubes, as the man behind Matt versus Japan. Fantastic YouTube channel, one of my favorites. And Matt has been on the channel before. We've had, in fact, my last conversation with Matt is one of the most popular videos on my channel. So that was about a year ago, Matt, I believe. So it's
Yeah, just about. I think so.
so yeah, it's time for a deeper dive where we're going to be talking about how things have changed for Matt over the last year, what he's working on, and some interesting questions as well, which I'll save up for later. So, Matt, you ready for a rabbit hole?
Yeah, let's go. Thanks so much for, and I should say thanks so much for having me on again. And yeah, let's do it.
My pleasure. This is going to be a two-parter. So if you want to hear the second part of this conversation, that's going to be over on Matt's channel, which we'll put a link to below. So head over there right away and check that one out. So Matt, it's been a year. What's new? What's new with you?
Yeah, well, probably the biggest thing is I started Refold with my co-founder, Ethan. And so, yeah, I think last time we talked, I was still doing MIA. Unfortunately, didn't really work out with my ex-business partner. And so started this new venture called Refold. And it's been, it might be coming up on 6 months actually since the initial launch. And so, yeah, it's so far things are have been really exciting. We created a whole new website, and up on the website, we already have a pretty fleshed out guide on how to learn any language. And we're working on language specific guides. And we also have a free Discord community where it's actually a series of interconnected Discord servers where each target language has their own server, so they can really customize the server to fit whatever needs people learning that language have and have their own community.
Awesome. So, I mean, one of the things I've always much admired about you is the fact, is just the depth at which you think about these issues. Because I mean, a lot of the time with language learning, a lot of it's so anecdotal in the way that it's talked about, and that's totally valid. You know, I'm a big fan of people's experiences, in life with languages being valid. But I think there's a kind of a lack sometimes of actually deep thinking about language learning, and I've always been really impressed with the way that you take the time to set out your thoughts. And I remember spending a long time reading through MIA, which stands for Mass Immersion Approach, although this is the old thing now. But I've seen that you've also done something similar on Refold. So maybe just to kick us off, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, so set out the stall for Refold. Tell us what the .la stands for, because I'm super curious about that. And then tell us what's the headline.
Yeah, well, so the URL for Refold is refold.la, and the LA, we like to say it stands for language, or you could also say it stands for language acquisition if you wanted to. But the real deal is just that the .com domain was out of our budget currently, so we had to compromise.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is that people don't. I think people use search a lot more now than they actually type in URLs to Google, and they're just as likely to just type in Refold Matt or something like that into Google, and they'll find you either way.
Yeah. So hopefully, and we have the link everywhere as well. Like if you're in the description of my YouTube videos or on Twitter. So yeah, I don't think it'll be an issue. But
yeah. So tell us about Refold and what's the aim? What's your mission?
Yeah, well, I think the headline is the roadmap to true fluency. And I would say we're basically trying to take immersion learning, which is a type of language learning that's been around for a long time, but has always remained a kind of niche. It's never really been part of it's never been a very big player in the very broad conversation about language learning. And so we're trying to take this niche way of learning a language and put it into a form where it's much more accessible to a wider audience. And through that, try to basically deliver it to more people, because that's how I learned Japanese. It gave me very good results. And I see a lot of people struggling with methods that don't work.
Yeah. So, I mean, so you and I are fighting the same battle, albeit in slightly different ways, which is interesting. Maybe we'll get into that on the video on your channel a little bit more. But yeah, so you're certainly preaching to the choir as far as immersion goes over here and on this channel. I guess it's worth talking about why it is that immersion is kind of underrepresented in the mainstream, because I think everybody understands on an intuitive level that if you immerse yourself in the language, you will learn, right?
Hmm.
And yet when it comes to the, at least of, the commonly available methods and things like that, immersion is basically nowhere to be seen. The closest you'll get is your teacher will say, oh yeah, no, go away and do some extra reading. So do your homework and then watch some movies or read some books. And it's
Hmm.
like, well, hang on, that should be the whole point, not not an afterthought. So I mean, what do you think it is that immersion is just as a as something that's kind of so intuitive and obvious has generally failed to catch on in the
Yeah, well,
in the
I think
mainstream?
one of the big reasons just could be is because it's had bad marketing. No one has actually taken the time to made a really good case for it, and then make sure that case gets out there. I think when it comes to like what gets popular and what doesn't get popular, marketing that's what I've been learning more actually this past year. Marketing plays a big role in that, and doing good marketing is not easy or cheap. So I think that could be a big part of it, but also it there's some bitter pills you need to swallow to really fully get on the immersion train. And I think one of the biggest ones that I talk about a lot at Refold is what I call tolerating ambiguity, which is basically being okay with not understanding everything, or in fact, in some cases, not understanding very much at all. Through the traditional education system, I think we're all kind of trained to, never move on to the next thing until you've mastered the thing you're currently on. And if you haven't mastered it, then that probably means you're stupid, or you've done something wrong. And so stop what you're doing and make sure that you fully understand thing A before you move on to thing B. And so people, that get so ingrained into them, they try to bring that to language learning when they start language learning, but it just doesn't apply. If in order to immerse yourself in the language, no matter how much study or preparation you've done, when you actually jump into a native movie or a comic book or TV show or something, you're not going to understand that much of it. And so getting over that and learning to be okay with the fact that you're not understanding, sticking with it anyway, I think that isn't so easy for a lot of people.
Yeah,
It's not so easy to market. And so that's why we've been trying to explain just the importance of it and change people's mindset about it.
yeah, there is an adoption problem, isn't there? And I think this comes from it comes from the fact that, as you say, we're kind of trained to break things down into any skill or anything, any subject that we're trying to learn. We're used to breaking it down into the smallest possible component parts and then kind of rebuilding that inside our brains as knowledge. And so people look for a similar experience with language learning, don't they look for they want to be able to feel and perceive that progress. But the trouble is that I think one of the big misunderstandings with language learning is that people misunderstand what progress is. Like, language learning is not simply assembling blocks of knowledge and then voila, you're off to the races. It is much more about kind of creating a new world and creating a set of experiences which then kind of come together to become your ability and your competence in the language. So I heard recently about a term in the app world, in the startup world, where people are building apps, and I forget exactly what the term was, but I think it was TTF. Have you heard of this?
Mm-mm.
I might be getting it totally wrong, but it's this or something very similar. And TTF, I believe, stands for time to fun. And so this is the idea that when you open up a new app, you've basically got this TTF, right? And you can grade different apps based on how quickly you provide an injection of fun to the user. And one of the reasons that TikTok has taken off so much is because it's instant. You open it up, bam, you've got videos, swipe videos, bam, you've got the TTF is like 2 seconds or something like that. And apparently the kind of industry standard to aim for is 7 seconds. If you don't provide fun, or aka gratification, within 7 seconds, you're screwed basically. And when I heard that, it made me think, my God, like, I'm trying to apply that to language learning via immersion. And then your TTF is like, you got to count it in the years, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we're nowhere near the point where language learning, at least immersion learning, can compete with TikTok. At least not in a direct kind of way. And so that's why I think right now the kind of biggest audience that I see coming to Refold are people they really want to learn a language. They've tried it different ways and nothing's worked for them. So they're in a way desperate. A lot of people, they're like, I just want to find something that works because this is really important to me. And because it's something they're passionate about, they're willing to push through a long period of it maybe not being so fun. But I do think that if we truly want to basically overtake Duolingo, in terms of really getting immersion learning to be the mainstream way for learning a language, then we're going to have to really do a lot of rehauling and really rethink a lot of things. Maybe use, artificial intelligence to generate custom-made comprehensible input to individuals or something like that, which I think will come perhaps like within the next 10 years, maybe sooner than we all think. But I think for right now, we're the way that I know that Ethan, my co-founder, kind of thinks about it is of that adoption curve, where when a new concept comes onto the market, first there's a very niche of early or what's called innovators, or I can't remember.
Yeah, pioneers.
Yeah, kind of pioneers who, they're very small and they're willing to do something that's not well established, doesn't have a good track record, just because they believe in the concept or the idea, and that's like 1 or 2% of people, very very small percentage. And then there's the early adopters. Once the ideal gets a little more established, there's a new chunk of people, and then there's this whole curve of adoption. And so I think we view immersion learning as being kind of in the early adopter stage, where still it's not really mature enough to reach the general market, but we're just focusing on the portion of the kind of adoption curve that we're at, trying to optimize to that. And then we'll kind of, once we feel like we've really matured enough, maybe we'll think more about like, okay, now our enemy is TikTok. How do we compete with that? Yeah. Although I will say, we talk about in the guide that one language learning technique you can do is make a new TikTok account and only watch videos in your target language. And if you reject the videos that are not in your target language enough, eventually you'll only get recommended target language videos. And so I'm a little ambivalent about it, because I feel like, maybe that will give you a lot of input. You're also kind of sacrificing your dopamine system. I'm not personally a TikTok user. I'm kind of concerned about just getting losing my attention span, basically. Yeah, but if you're already on TikTok, then hey, you might as well do it in your target language.
There is different degrees of compromise, aren't there, with this kind of thing? Because I think there's a very strong case to be made that TikTok for language learning, just forget about it, simply from the point of view that why do things that are going to drain your attention, your well of attention dry, when you can do something else which is going to be nourishing. But then, at the same time, it doesn't pay to be too draconian and strict with what you are and aren't supposed to do, because then you just lose people along the way. So how do you think about this issue, this challenge of compromise between what we might think of as an effective method and then what we might enjoy on a personal level? How do you think about finding that balance?
Well, I try not to be too black and white about it. I think I used to be more black and white about it. I used to be a little like kind of an elitist, being like, oh, come on, be hardcore, cut out all the garbage from your life, do the thing that's most optimal. And I think that was the ideal I personally held myself to. I don't think I ever even lived up to my own ideal, but I would push it onto myself and other people. But what I realize now is that it is a spectrum, and you can move fluidly around this spectrum of compromise. And you can start off doing, maybe a little bit a day in your target language, or doing something like, maybe you start off, you don't have enough willpower, you just can't be bothered enough to watch a target language TV show without English subtitles. So you just start with English subtitles. It's like, well, that's a big step up from watching something entirely in English, right? And then maybe through that, you make a little bit of progress, and through making a little bit of progress, that naturally motivates you to take it to the next level. So I think that doing whatever you can realistically get yourself to do is a really good start, and you can always increase over time. And what I've personally found is that feeling your own progress with language learning is kind of the generator function of motivation in the long term. Initially, the motivation is the idea, oh, look, wouldn't it be cool to know this language, or I really want to know this language, but that alone doesn't last that long. So you have to quickly get to the point where you're feeling your own progress, and that becomes what's generating the ongoing motivation that really gets you to wake up every day and do it. And so I think starting wherever you're at and building on it can lead to this exponential kind of feedback loop, where the more that you get better, the more your brain's like, oh, this activity is high value because it actually produces growth in me, and then you want to do more.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge there is to create this mechanism whereby you don't just get into a kind of into a zone of complacency, because to take the watching movies with English subtitles example, it's very easy to just kind of get into this comfort zone there and never push yourself forward, right? So the challenge is we know this as independent learners, we have to always be alert to this ourselves. It's even harder to create this kind of behavior change in other people, but it's like providing this forum whereby people are challenged to reflect and ask themselves the question, okay, what stage am I at, and how can I push it to the next level, and be conscious of their own biases, of their own strengths and weaknesses. And I do think that for most people, who, until you get experience, you do kind of need this chaperone along the way. And I see quite a strong parallel here with I'm a big fan of coaches. I make quite heavy use of coaches in business, in health and fitness as well. And I couldn't live without them, because I just find that there's so much stuff that I know intellectually, and can like preach to people until the cows come home. But I actually need someone to tell me to help, point it out to myself.
Yeah.
And by having that person there, even though it's stuff I already know, and you could easily make the argument I'm paying for someone to tell me stuff I already know. Nevertheless, like the practical impact on me is just absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah. Well, that I think that you can get a similar effect with a learning community, because we have these free Discord servers, which are essentially just chat rooms. And I think in there, it by entering this environment where there's other people who are also serious about learning, and you see them talking about the way they think about their learning and their goals and their striving, and them being disappointed when they don't meet their goals, I think that can have a big effect on people. And, just being able to ask questions, ask your doubts to other people who've been through that, and have them comfort you. I think, that can make a night and day difference, because immersion learning can be a really lonely pursuit. Like for me, it was a lonely pursuit. It was a lot of time alone in my room, not being able to share my experiences with anybody. But now there's these group immersion hubs in the Discord server where someone will just go, they'll just start watching a show, they'll share their screen, and a bunch of other people will go in the voice chat, and they can watch it together. And so I do think that's another something that really makes the immersion learning process more accessible to people.
Yeah. So I made a video all about you a few months ago.
Yeah, I saw it. Very nice job, by the way. I liked it.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun making it. And I'll link it to it up in a card or in the description below. And what that video shows is how you went about learning Japanese. The big question though is, what would you do differently now? Not if you're going to go back to the 14-year-old Matt, who obviously is going to have a very different mindset to the Matt today. What would you do differently? I mean, first of all, do you think you would still be able to, if you're starting from scratch today with Japanese, do you think you would be able to reach the level that you did? And second part to that question, how would you go about it with reference to the kind of Refold methodology?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first part of the question, it's really impossible to answer, because if I never learned Japanese, then I would be a completely different person today. So I don't know what that person would be like, or what they would be interested in. I mean, there's a good chance I never would have gone that far with Japanese, but yeah, I mean, language learning is such an embodied thing. Like the motivations are so particular to a certain time and place and circumstance that, like, what would be the reason I would be learning Japanese right now? For me right now, I already know Japanese, so it's like kind of impossible to answer. But I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things that I would change. I think one of the biggest things that I would change is I would be less reliant on reading, and I would have more listening from the beginning. And like Refold, we really emphasize watching with subtitles, because we kind of view that as a way to get the best of both worlds in terms of reading and listening, because you can hear everything being pronounced, and then you can also easily look things up, or just see what is being said. But what I kind of found, like what I've seen based on the language learners I know well and myself, is that most people are kind of listening dominant or reading dominant in their ability. Yeah. And when people develop being overly reading dominant, they seem to the way their brain seems to process the language always seems to be a little different. And the friends that I have that are the best at spoken Japanese are the people who learned largely through listening, and the people who can like get pitch accent the most intuitively, and like have the easiest time just picking up words just through listening without having to see them written. So sometimes for me, I'm very, very good at kanji. That's like one of my biggest strengths, and that's really cool, and I appreciate that. And I know some of my other Japanese friends are jealous of that. But then I'm jealous of them in how, it feels like it took so much work for me to improve my pitch accent, and I'm still not perfect. and it still just feels like my brain, in a certain way, it has to, like, if I can't see the kanji in my mind, it feels like I haven't understood the word, which I know is kind of a sign that my brain's like overly reading dominant.
And so you feel that's an issue for you because you learned so much through reading?
I think I let my reading ability get like too far ahead of my listening ability. Like
Yeah,
if
well,
you
I can
take
certainly relate to that.
yeah, like I can, the way in Refold that we be, like, basically getting better at reading is inherently easier than getting better at listening,
Right.
and at least in my opinion, because it's listening is basically just reading plus the additional challenge of the speed is built in. You can't control the speed, and you have to be able to determine what words are being said, like auditorily, whereas when you're reading, they're right there on the page. It's easy to identify them, and so it's just inherently harder. And so if you're doing any reading at all, probably your reading ability is going to be ahead of your listening ability. So the way I think about it is just how much of a gap is there? Because if the gap is relatively small, like your reading gets a little bit and then you catch your listening ability up, then I think you're probably going to be fine. You will end up being pretty balanced. But for me, I didn't have this framework of like letting the gap not get too big or not. And so I kind of was just like, I'll just master reading 100%, then I'll come back and master listening 100%. And I just thought that would be the most efficient way, because I know that there is some carryover between reading and listening. But I think I got too reading dominant. I spent like tons of time reading and watching with subtitles, and not enough time also doing that, like watching raw, until like later on. So yeah, that's something that I would do differently. And I think another component of this is that it really depends on what your final goal is with a language, because when we talked about compromises in terms of your attention span and just like what activities you're doing, but I think there's another layer of compromises within the language learning process, because I think to the degree that you lean on listening, you will make faster progress in the language. Like that's been my experience with Chinese, although it's I'm kind of biased because I'm familiar with the characters. But so if your goal is really just speed, then really relying on the reading, it's probably going to be a good strategy. Just if you're thinking like, okay, I want to spend the rest of my life with this language, like I want to move to this country, live my whole life in the language, then maybe even it might be worth taking a process that takes longer to reach fluency, but has a better result of the way that the language is formatted within your brain is more aligned with the way it's formatted in the brain of a native speaker, which is being very listening dominant, basically. Yeah. And so with Japanese, now it's such a big part of my life. I kind of think like, well, if I was going to dedicate, 10 plus years to this thing, maybe it would have been okay to delay basic fluency to have Japanese be formatted more naturally within my brain.
Yeah. And I guess the caveat with all of this though, is that it's such a long process, but with so much work involved, that if at any point, you start to lose motivation, or you feel that you're not, this isn't for you, or you kind of wave in whatever way, then the imperative is to kind of stop what you're doing and change course and accept the compromise, because otherwise, it's sooner or later you're going to just you're going to implode.
Yeah, totally. So that's why in Refold we kind of built the path around what we think is going to be like like taking all the factors into account, the best kind of mixture of components for the largest number of people, where we're assuming that you want to get to a solid level of fluency and that you don't want to spend your whole life doing this necessarily. Like you want to get there within a couple years. You're serious about this. You want to make it happen. But also that, we're not going too extreme to the end of like, just like don't learn how to read at all, because that will bias the way your brain processes the language. Like some people say that. I think there's some truth to that, but I just think it's too extreme, basically.
Yeah, no, sure. I think it's fantastic what you're describing there, Matt. And for what it's worth, I do think there is a lot to be said for sort of setting out your stall and saying, look, this is not for everybody. Because inherently it's impossible to make something that's for if you try and make something that's for everybody, you end up with Duolingo, and even then it's not for everybody, right? So I think that certainly I find with my story learning method, which focuses very heavily on reading, I call it reading plus listening, as opposed to listening plus reading, if that makes sense. But certainly it's like I've just found that it seems to generate more success overall if I say at the beginning, look, if you do this, you're going to be reading stories and you're going to be doing a lot of reading. If that doesn't sound like fun to you, find something else that does. And that kind of does end up, I find it I find it far preferable than trying to kind of impose this as the method that's going to solve everybody's problems. So I think that what you're describing there in terms of like finding that balance between the extreme and the mediocre, but then like sticking with that and say, look, this is how we do things. I think there's a lot of value to that.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that we're still, if you look at the broad culture of language learning, we're still very much on the extreme side, because this is a culture where, you know, doing 1 or 2 hours a day is, you're on the low side, right? You're not really going too hardcore. And then if you're doing 5, 6 hours a day plus, it's like, okay, now you're really solid, you know? So to most people, that sounds completely insane already, you know, in terms of just how intense it is. But it's still a little bit more relaxed compared to what I personally did, which required like utter dedication, locking myself in my room. Like now there's people who, you know, they still have a full-time job, maybe they have a family, and they're able to find the time to get in a couple of hours a day and make really solid progress. So
yeah. And even then for someone in that situation, you know, work, family, all that, I mean, that is serious dedication to take 2 hours. I mean, that's 2 hours that you're not spending with your kids, you know, which we're, you know, in a world where every hour that you spend with your kids matters. So yeah, absolutely. What do people get wrong about you, Matt?
Oh, so many things. But let's see. I jotted down the top 3 right here. Also, when you say what did they get wrong about me, then I want to go complain about all the things the haters don't get. But I'm going to try to focus on what people I think get wrong about my language learning ideas.
Yeah, the golden rule with the haters is that we don't even indulge them with attention. Or acknowledgement. So let's
what haters? Yeah. So, yeah, I think so. One of them is that people think that I think that you don't need to practice speaking to get good at speaking. And I can see why people think that, because I do talk about how the majority of speaking ability, I think, comes from what you've acquired, and what you've acquired comes from input. And it was my experience with Japanese that after getting a couple years of almost full-time input, when it came time for me to speak Japanese, I could speak it. But I wasn't great. It was still clunky. I made a lot of mistakes. I was slow. In order to get really comfortable with speaking and be able to speak with very accurate grammar, pronunciation, I had to do a lot of practice. Just the way that we view it at Refold is that it's better to practice after you have a foundation and input, so that instead of trying to translate in your head, you're able to kind of speak intuitively the first time, coming from this pool of what you've acquired. So I do think you need to practice speaking a lot, and speaking practice is important. I think it's better to do that after you've acquired a certain amount of the language.
Absolutely.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is people think that I think that comprehensibility doesn't matter, and that you can just turn on any random show even if you understand nothing, and that's a good idea. And the real way that I think about it is that comprehensibility is very important. First of all, because as Stephen Krashen has pointed out, we acquire language when we understand messages in the language. So if you're not understanding anything, then you're probably not learning very much. Maybe your brain is still getting better at recognizing individual sounds or something, but you're not going to be learning very, very efficiently. And the other thing is that it's not very enjoyable when you're not understanding anything. And if it's not enjoyable, you're not going to do it. So that's, in a way, an even bigger issue. But I view it as there's comprehensibility, and then there's also just your inherent enjoyment in various content. And a lot of times there's a tension between these two things, because what you really want to watch is maybe your favorite anime or this other book, but it's way above your level. And the stuff that's like on your level are graded readers and stuff that's really boring. So I think that it's more about finding the balance, because a lot of times there is no ideal input that's very compelling to you and the perfect level of comprehensibility. And so sometimes it might make sense to compromise the comprehensibility in order to spend time with something that really excites you. Because if it really excites you, you're going to push through the difficulty, you know, even if it's kind of an uphill battle.
Awesome. And you got one more?
And the last one is people think that I think that you shouldn't study grammar at all. And I think it's because it comes along with immersion learning. Immersion learning has this image of like you just sit and watch TV shows and you do no work, and somehow and then you like magically get good. I think it's possible to do that, but it's going to be very slow and inefficient. I'm a big advocate of studying vocabulary with Anki, as well as learning the basics of grammar, not because that grammar knowledge is going to help you produce the language, but because it's going to make your input more comprehensible. And like I just mentioned, comprehensibility is important for both enjoyment and for acquiring the language quickly.
I guess it's a very interesting list, and I felt myself kind of nodding along with every misapprehension that you said. I think it's the difficulty with all this stuff is that you can always find the rare case where someone's done that, right? And I spoke to a guy called Pablo recently on my channel, who has a channel called Dreaming Spanish, and he lives in Thailand, married to a Thai woman, and he said that he became completely fluent in Thai with nothing but immersion, 100% immersion, meaning with people, listening, no grammar study whatsoever, no study of the, I don't think he said no study of the alphabet or anything like that either, just for pure immersion with zero study whatsoever. And I find that, like, I mean, I have no reason to doubt that. I'm sure it's true. I find that just stunning. And, you know, tons of respect for him to be able to do that. But I think it's just so rare that someone has the conditions and the environment and also the temperament to be able to do that. It's like, can you do it? Yes, you can. You know, you can go to the moon, but, you know, the chances are you're not going to. So as ever, it's all about, I guess it all comes down to developing one of the things I always say is, like, you know, figure out how you learn best, and then you won't care what I think about language learning or what Matt thinks. You know, figure out your own. Like someone said that about weightlifting once. You know, learn to lift 400 pounds on a deadlift, and then you won't care what I have to say about a technique for lifting. I think that kind of sums up language learning for me. Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really could have picked up on any of those three things you mentioned, but then that would have meant another 3 videos. So I restrained myself.
Yeah.
Refold and Matt, where should people go to find out more about you?
Well, yeah. So my YouTube channel is Matt vs. Japan. Refold is Refold.la. I started a newsletter recently, and you can subscribe at mattvsjapan.com. The link's in a bunch of my video descriptions, so it shouldn't be too hard to find.
Awesome. Thanks, man. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on.